All right, so today we're going to switch it up a bit, and I'm going to talk specifically about single men. It's the biggest group of homeless, as most of you probably have picked up on. It's about 4 men to every 1 woman out on the streets. So you can see that the focus is there. You see a similar ratio, between prisons for men and prisons for women. There's lots of reasons why there's more men than women. I'm not going to go into that right now. But anyways, the number of men out there, a lot of people feel that it's a static population. It's not. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of coming in and going out again and so forth. But the core group, which is maybe 20% of all the men, are the chronic ones, and they're there all the time. The objective that I have, which I hope the cities adopt, is to get rid of the encampments entirely. Nothing good happens on the streets for those who live there. It's a downward spiral. Their situations only grow worse. About 35% of the men have mental health problems, so you can imagine that being on the streets, living rough, exacerbates the situation considerably. The men that are on the streets, many of them are staying in tents now. I see a lot of videos of tents out there. And in my view, the use of tents is a real game changer. It gives cover to those that are low-level drug dealers. It gives cover to those that are pimping and prostituting. It's a magnet for men who come to the city and feel that throw up a pup tent and you can live on the streets. It's an option that wasn't available years ago. And, you also notice a lot of bicycles. These people, they don't buy their bikes. I would venture that almost all of those bicycles are stolen bicycles. You see shopping carts, they're stolen. You see some people even have barbecues. I don't know where they get them, certainly the tents. I don't imagine too many of these men go to Dick's Sporting Goods and buy their tents. Somebody's giving them to them, and it's not doing them a service. The encampments are an infringement on the public use of public spaces, and it's not a kindness to leave people on the streets fending for themselves that way. When I worked with the City of Toronto Homeless in the late 70s, we were approached by the Veterans Administration about a building that they called an old soldier's home. And the men living in that building were World War I veterans. And the building was set up for 60 people. When they contacted us, I think it was 77, 78, they said that there was only 20 guys left. But they had promised these men that they could live out their days there. So they said to us, would you like to use this building as a shelter for families? We can have all the men on the 4th floor, and you can have the families on the 2nd and the 3rd floor. And we said yes. And it worked great. It was a great synergy. The old men got a kick out of the antics of some of the children, and the kids would look with big eyes at these old men that had been soldiers and so forth. And it was a wonderful thing. And we cared for those old fellows to the end of their days. And it got me thinking about, hey, we got a lot of old guys that are in the shelters who are not veterans maybe, but who are in a similar situation. They're over 50, which for a homeless man is getting elderly. In 1981, when I became the director of the Homeless Services Department, we had about 2,500 single men that were staying in the system. I doubt if any of those are still living today. their lives are not long. For a period of time in 1975, when I was still fairly young myself, I was in charge of indigent burials in the city of Toronto. Every city has indigent burials. These are bodies that nobody claims. These are bodies where there's no assets, no money. Somebody has to bury them, and the legislation points the finger at the city and said, we have to take care of that. That year, we buried over 900 individuals who were indigent, who had funerals. Basically, they took the body from the morgue to the cemetery and they buried it in the pauper section. So these are people that we arranged for clergy. We never cremated the bodies because if somebody would come out of the woodwork later, cremation is not accepted by all faith groups. So we buried the bodies in simple pine boxes. But the thing that struck me the most was that year there was over 100 John Does and Jane Does that we buried. These are people that were not only indigent, but nobody even knew their name. They might have been found in an alleyway, they might have been picked up by EMS and taken to hospital and died there, but nobody knew their name. They had no ID on them and so forth. And it really struck me, I think I was 28 or 29 at that time. I come from a family of 11, and we always had a younger brother or whatever running around and 2.5, 3 years old, entertaining the rest of the older ones, and we were all laughing and encouraging, and the kid was getting a kick out of, being the center of attention and so forth. And then thinking of a Jane Doe, I'm thinking maybe a 7-year-old girl shrieking and laughing in the playground with her friends and so forth. And then you think, what happened to John Doe and Jane Doe? What happened in their lives? What fork of the road did they take that led them away? And what decisions maybe did they make, or what misfortune befell them that at the end of the day, they were buried in a pauper's grave. All cemeteries were required to have a section for that, with no name and no marker. There was a brass plate about that big that had a number on it, and they buried 3 deep on each plot. And I thought, this is incredibly sad. Now, maybe that problem is being dealt with better today because of computer age and so forth, but certainly we help people after they came into our shelter system. We helped them get identification, and we wrote away for birth certificates. We got their social security numbers, or in Canada they call it social insurance numbers. And I would hope that more is being done this day, that people don't fall between the cracks that way. If the city takes it upon itself to remove these tents, and you can't do all of them all at once, but I venture that a lot of the people whose tents are taken away and the sites are cleaned up and they're told not to come back, many of them will go back to their home communities. People don't realize that, but like in San Francisco, you not only get a tent, you get free needles, which is an incredibly bad idea, and the city even gives you cash. And then on top of that, people panhandle. And as long as the cardboard sign they're holding up has got the word homeless in there, it'll start working for them. They'll start getting cash. Panhandling is an old term that goes back to before FDR came in with his social programs, when blind people had to beggar on the streets. And a blind person can't see, so he has a tin can, and when you drop a coin in, he can hear it. And some of them could get so good at it they could tell what denomination the coin was. But that's where the origin of the term comes from. But panhandling is just another word for begging. And not all the people that are panhandling are in fact homeless. We've heard stories of university students doing it. In Canada, it got really bad because the government exchanged the $1 bill and the $2 bill for coins called the loonie and the toonie. And I was in charge of the homeless situation at the time, and panhandling just went through the roof because instead of getting a quarter, now you're getting $1 or sometimes even $2 for everybody that was inclined to help you. And even if they are homeless, I know where the money goes. The money that you give somebody begging on the street almost never goes for food or clothes or any of the other necessities. It goes towards their addiction. So the broader message is that you're saying to people, hey, we'll give you a tent to sleep in, we'll give you a sleeping bag and air mattress. There's places where you can get meals, there's lots of free clothing around. We'll give you money. You can break into cars if you get desperate. But all you need to do is concentrate all your efforts every day on getting what you need to buy what you are addicted to. Focus on your addiction, we'll take care of the rest. It's a really bad message. And I don't mean to be so cynical about this, but you have to be real about it. This is basically what happens. And the men that go into shelters, they have to keep a curfew. They have to maintain a certain level of hygiene. They have to be nonviolent. There's a lot of expectations for those who stay in shelters. But I don't think any of those things are too much to ask. If you're living on the streets, you do not have laundry, you do not have toilets, and you do not have showers. 3 of the most important things that you have in a household. You don't have that on the streets. In San Francisco, you get a lot of waste on the streets. You get feces, vomit, you get all kinds of urine and rotting food and droppings from mice and rodents and the seagulls and so forth. It becomes a hazard. I mean, this is a public health thing. If you walk, in San Francisco, it's really hard to walk. It's a very compacted city. It's very hard to walk somewhere without walking by these tent encampments. And you're going to pick some of this stuff up on the bottom of your shoes, and you can bring it into your office, or you bring it into your car. You might bring it home at the end of the day. That infestation is spreading, and we're talking about typhus and Hep C and TB, and I mean there's going to be more and more diseases that come out of that. And it's very ironic because we live in America. This is a country where huge investments have been made in giving us safe water, and huge investments have been made in a sewage system that covers all. And these are such incredible things that add to the quality of life in our cities and so forth. And yet we're exempting this group and saying live on the streets. Over the years, I've heard a lot of different terms for the homeless. There was a time when they were called vagrants. And this goes back actually post-Civil War or war between the states, where a lot of people were cut loose and were drifting in society, and small towns and cities did not want them in their towns. So they had vagrancy laws, and if you didn't have the means of support with you, usually in the form of money or a place to stay, you were ordered out of the city. And this went on right into the 70s, where the police would pick up vagrants and would drive them to the edge of town and tell them to keep going. So this was the attitude at one time, and many of these vagrants, of course, set up hobo camps during the Great Depression and so forth. But it's not a term we use anymore. We do use the term derelict, and a lot of people are not clear about what that term means. Derelict, for those of us who are in the profession, have a very specific meaning. Let me give you an example. A derelict, if it's a cold day and he's got wet shoes with no socks, his hands are white from the cold and so forth, and you say to this man, here's a pair of wool socks and a nice pair of gloves. On this hand, I got 2 packs of cigarettes. You can either have this hand or this hand. And he takes those 2 packs of cigarettes. That's a derelict. A derelict is someone who does not feel entitlement to his discomfort, and all he thinks about is his addiction and his need. And this happens at a lot of different levels. And people that are derelict are so far away from being ready for any type of social housing or rent geared income housing, they can't maintain it. The only option for somebody who is derelict is to stay in a shelter. And hopefully by staying in the shelter, their behaviors will start to modify, and they'll start more self-care and eating properly and so forth. But failing that, you'll find them dead under a bridge before too long. We have seen individuals who will drink Lysol. You say, Lysol? I mean, is that spray stuff? Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's a disinfectant spray, and I'm not blaming Lysol, but the propellant is at the top of the aerosol can. They punch a hole just under the top rim, and that lets the propellant gas out. And then they turn it and they punch a hole on the other side, and you can pour it out now into a container, and it looks like water. But it isn't. It's 70% alcohol, it's 30% chemicals. The alcohol is what they usually dilute it with some water, and that's how they drink it. We always estimated that once somebody became a Lysol drinker, they had less than a year left, because it ruined their organs and it slowly killed them. And it's kind of tragic the lengths they will go to chasing their addictions. So it's a terrible problem to have, but at a minimum, we need to get these folks into shelters. When I talked earlier about the old soldiers' home, we later opened some more of those facilities because the idea got twigged to us. I opened a facility called Birchcliff Residence, and for, again, 60 old men, not soldiers necessarily. They're all over 50. The average age was, I think, 62 or something like that. And it was great. Now, they didn't get their own apartment or anything. There was like 3 or 4 to a bedroom, but they were big rooms. And these 60 men, and there was a dining room downstairs. We had bingo games. It was like almost like a home for the elderly, the way it was run. And it worked out really good. But the thing that was important, 2 things actually. One is it got the old guys away from the young guys, because the young guys were victimizing them. A lot of these old guys were getting a disability check or something, and the young guys would con them out of the money. But the other thing is, by creating these 60 beds, I freed up 60 beds out of the shelters, because all of these guys were hand-picked out of shelters. And, they weren't up to dealing with the rough and tumble of shelters. So by setting up this, let's call it a lodging house, we were able to take the pressure off the shelters, which took the pressure off the streets and so forth. People say, well, Toronto gets cold winters, so that pushes people indoors, and it's true. The summer population and the winter population has changed a lot. But San Francisco is one of the coldest cities in the U.S. that doesn't get snow. At this time of the year, right now it's early November, late afternoon that fog rolls in, and you get chilled to the bone. And even if you're sleeping in a tent, you're going to be shivering most of the night. It's not a livable situation. It's really not an option. And the fact that people can do it or do it doesn't make it the right thing to do. Also, most of these cities, the coastal cities, especially Seattle, even Vancouver and so forth, the storm sewers empty into the ocean. They don't go in through a sewage treatment plant. That's the sanitary sewers. But the storm sewers, where you have the grates on the side of the streets and so forth. So a lot of that waste that's being produced by these encampments, if it's not cleaned up regularly, will end up in the oceans. And, you know, we all agree that that's not a good thing. There's been an attempt, I find it kind of comical, by some. They want to change the language. And I agree that some of the past language, the worst thing that a homeless guy will react to is if you call him a bum. For some reason that sets them off. So, I mean, we didn't do it, but we certainly heard of it. They do not like to be called a bum. They like to be called homeless. That's a certain status to it. Even the veterans, who you would think would be the most revered group of people, see that homeless attracts more attention than being a veteran. So, but there's a group that wants to use the term undomiciled. I don't know where that's coming from, but it's not going to go anywhere. I can tell you that right now. But you know, I don't care what the term is, but it should not be seen as a status thing at all. These are very pathetic and apathetic. Most of the homeless that I dealt with over the years, there was never any violence. You know, it was interesting in 1981 when I became the big chief. I was told by colleagues and other department heads, you better make sure your name isn't in the public phone book. This was back in the days when you had phone books this thick. And I said, I'm not worried about that. For 22 years, I was the director. Over those 22 years, we had close to 250,000 people stay in our various shelters and so forth. My name is not a common name. It's easy to pick out of a phone book. In that 22 years, I never got one call from a homeless person. And they knew who I was because my name was in the papers, you know, 2-3 times a week for more than 20 years. Never once called me. So this idea that the homeless are particularly violent, there are some individuals amongst that, but that's true of the general population too. But most homeless people are pretty apathetic and non-violent. And the shelters are really the place where they can go. And for those who can stabilize and do better, then I think that the next step is these lodging homes. One of the things that I did during my tenure is we opened up lodging homes for people that had mental health problems. At the time I retired in 2003, we had 60 lodging homes with 950 beds. There were about half men, half women. All of them had severe mental health problems. By being in the lodging home, they had a very stable environment to stay in. They were able to personalize their space where their bed was. They had proper meals. There was laundry, clean linens. There was all those things that were there for them. And the staff, because these were all mentally ill adults, were able to get them to see a doctor and get them on meds. And almost, you know, for schizophrenia especially, and for obsessive compulsive disorders and so forth, medications are vital. I mean, I'm not disparaging talk therapy, but it doesn't begin to replace medication therapy. And this is a huge contrast, because that's 950 people living in these lodging homes who are not out on the streets using heroin and all these other dangerous chemicals. They're now on proper medications which quiet the voices they hear and quell the anxieties they feel, and and they can live a more normal life. So it's a huge step forward, and all the cities need to be doing that. Anyways, I think that should be the next step. The idea that people can go straight from the streets into some sort of social housing, some can, very, very few can actually do it. It's too much. They're so far from being ready to live in independent housing of any sort, and so well-run shelters and shelters need to be properly funded and administered. There's no substitute for it. There's a thing about if your heart's not in it, you're going to do a poor job. And I think that's one of the reasons that cities do a bad job in terms of addressing the street problem, because they're not sure. Well, my view is that having proper shelters and lodging homes and so forth should be seen as an essential municipal service, not any different than police, fire, and ambulance and all of that. Cities should recognize it. And I understand that the burden is falling on the large cities, because in small towns, everybody knows who the local town drunk is. It's hard to have any kind of anonymity. The cities give you that. You can't panhandle in a small town. People won't give you money. The police all know who you are. I mean, you go to big cities to escape from that. And big cities, it's easier to find and buy drugs and all of that. So there are a lot of attractions to cities. But, I think the federal and state governments really encourage all towns and cities. And I would say as a rule of thumb that towns and cities ought to have about one shelter bed for every 1,000 residents. So a town of 25,000 people should have about 25 shelter beds. And that's for battered women and youth and men and women and families, the whole thing. So one good-sized shelter to help these different groups. That would do a lot to help the cities so people don't have to leave town in order to find a service somewhere. Anyways, I hope this is helpful. These 10 lectures that I'm going to be doing, or videos, would be equivalent to an advanced course in university. I think most universities don't have the qualifications to really teach this. But certainly if you follow our videos and listen to the information I'm going to be providing in these 10 videos, or maybe 12, then I think we're open. My assistant JW here, who's my producer and cameraman and lighting director and sound man, he and I are going to share this thing 50-50, because he's a university student in his final year, and any help that he can get, he deserves. So if you write a comment or a question, and as long as it's not abusive, we'll do our best to answer it, and we'll pick the best ones to put them on air and try to fill out people's understanding of what we're talking about. So thank you. We'll see you again.